Thanks for joining us for Mastering the Next Generation of Delaware Science Standards. My name's Francis Vigent. Glad to have you here with us. We are going to take a quick look at a number of different dimensions of mastering the next generation of science standards in Delaware. First and foremost, we're going to take a look at where Delaware is at presently at the end of the 2015-2016 school year, and then jump into what makes the new next generation science standards a bit tougher, how those standards link to Common Core ELA and math, and how these changes affect methods for science instruction pre-K through 12. And we'll end up with a look at how science and engineering practices integrate with the arts. To give you a little bit of background on myself, I'm Francis Vigent. I'm a co-founder here at KnowAtom. KnowAtom is based just north of Boston in Salem, Massachusetts. We've been in existence for about 10 years, and we're a group of previous educators. Our previous life to KnowAtom involved being involved in public education. I myself am a former high school math teacher as well as an elementary and middle school STEM specialist. I spent almost 10 years grading children in some form and being involved in their science education. I guess the most important thing to point out when we think about the next generation science standards and the switch that's happening, or has been happening really for the last 3-4 years, is to really think about why science and engineering instruction really matters. Only 4% of students will become scientists or engineers. That's all we need. Even if we were to double it, so 8%, that's more than adequate for what we need as a nation to fill STEM degrees. But if you think about it at a deeper level, science, technology, engineering, and math is the perfect environment to teach higher order thinking skills. And those are skills that are relevant to any college or career choice that a student makes. It really makes them equipped to support STEM, to pursue STEM, whether they are going to have a PhD in physics, go on to be an engineer, or a salesperson, or a marketing person, or even a tradesperson. So the next generation science standards really are about higher order thinking, critical thinking skills, specifically creating, evaluating, and analyzing. What's important to think about there, and at least our organization, KnowAtom, where we approach this, is that by putting students into the role of scientist and engineer, we have the opportunity to engage them hands-on, minds-on, and really sharpen their thinking skills, help them develop the practices, as well as logical process knowledge, so that they can go from any question or any problem to an evidence-based solution. And so that's where curriculum, materials, and professional development come into it. So KnowAtom does produce next generation aligned curriculum, materials, professional development, basically kind of a all-in-one, everything you need to be able to accomplish grade 1 or 2 or 6 or 8 or so on science. But that's not what this webinar is about. But I'd like you just to understand that's really why these next generation science standards are so important, and kind of how that critical thinking flows through to the student's role in the classroom, and then, of course, to the actual materials and resources that you're developing yourself or you're purchasing from education companies. So nonetheless, let's jump right in and take a look at where Delaware is at. So back in 2014, Delaware put forward SMART goals, and it was really their goal that by the end of 2016-17, all stakeholder groups would understand the vision, rationale, have an implementation plan, and at least understand the state's implementation plan, and be in the process of rolling out NGSS. And much of that is intact. The second one here, that by the end of 2016-17, that a comprehensive assessment system that's fully aligned to NGSS will be implemented, is not something that has come to pass. And there has been a great deal of pushback from Delaware district leaders, and if you've been watching the news, you'll note that basically a couple months ago, around February of 2016, that a proposal to create new state-mandated science and social studies testing for grades 3 through 10 would have increased the amount of student time spent testing by about 25%. So Delaware decided to kind of reboot and try to find new science testing that's aligned with the next generation science standards, but is not as sort of time intensive, and with the hope of rolling that out in 2017, 2018 to replace the DCAS science exam currently in grades 5, 8, and 10. So whatever testing ends up being chosen, the expectation is that it's not for 2016-17, but for implementation in 2017-18. So it's kind of about at least a year here. And you know, with the expectation that the testing will remain at grades 5, 8, and 10, but that that it will be somewhere of a midpoint, perhaps between where the hope for testing was going and where it is presently in terms of the time intensity. The third piece of where Delaware is at presently is instruction that reflects all three dimensions of NGSS. And I think this is really a bit of an overstatement in terms of where classrooms are at presently. There's been a lot of ongoing professional development, and the Delaware Science Coalition, the Delaware Department of Education have really been working to get the word out, get teachers and teacher leaders, as well as building leaders up to snuff on what the next generation science standards are all about, what are the three dimensions, the science and engineering practices, the disciplinary core ideas, the cross-cutting concepts, and how do these performance expectations really, you know, how are they meaningfully different than sort of the previous 3 unit a year model that most Delaware classrooms were operating on. So that's probably, you know, that's going to be at least probably another 3 years before people are really well-oiled in their implementation of the NGSS reflecting all three dimensions. And we're going to talk about why that is in a moment. And then, of course, the fourth goal being that all K-12 schools will implement materials with fidelity. That's, you know, again, sort of part of that third goal. So let's just take a look at that timeline real quick. So basically, as you look at May into June, the NGSS implementation modules, development and deployment, those are not publicly available yet. Obviously the new science testing is also sort of been thrown back a bit. So where we are is a little bit behind on the schedule, but you can see what's already happened here in terms of the past professional development, piloting of resources, and so on. One of the issues with piloting of resources is that there are not a lot of well-aligned resources available. It's one of the things at KnowAtom that we're really proud of, is that we've been working on next generation style resources for the past 10 years, and as that next generation science standard development process was underway, we were continually, I guess we would maybe say, betting big on the next generation science standards and continually incorporating the recommendations as the standards went through their draft, the early publications from the Carnegie Corporation and others were the National Research Council's recommendations, or really findings on effective K-12 STEM education, that early report that came out, were all being published. And so, so we're at a much different place than most resource providers and certainly most districts who didn't engage in that process, because we have test data from actual standardized testing that's been in place in different states like Massachusetts and others. But the key here is really that the switch is a pretty big undertaking. as you see here on the timeline, not only do educators need to understand the standards and their dimensions, professional development needs to happen because there's a significantly new model for instruction under Next Generation Science Standards. And that old 3-unit-a-year model doesn't really fit well with the way the Next Generation Science Standards have been developed, and really they don't fit well with the nature of science and engineering. And it really has nothing to do with the Next Generation Science Standards, except to say that the Next Generation Science Standards are really close to what the nature of science and engineering actually is, and that's why there's a bit of a misfit. So when you currently check the state's website, you'll notice that Next Generation lesson plans and units aren't even available yet. And when you check for the assessments under 6 through 8, these aren't available. There is something for kindergarten that's there, but I would say that they're not available because when you look at the way that the documentation's even constructed, it doesn't align to the new standards. And you can actually see that right here. See how there are 3 strands: earth science, physical science, and life science. These don't actually align to the Next Generation Science Standards because the Next Generation Science Standards are adding a 4th dimension, the engineering, technology, and applications of sciences strand, and earth includes space science as well. So this is still a bit dated, and you can see that there's there's some thought about adding a 4th dimension here as the way they've articulated it. So some things are still shifting around. Things aren't ready yet where Delaware had hoped to have it on the timeline. When you look at the elementary level, you'll notice sort of a similar thing. What's available here is a reflection of what was available in 2009. So again, you see that 3-unit model. The strands are, again, the old strands. So I guess the big key takeaway is that this is a process that's a little behind schedule. The testing is at least a year behind. And unfortunately, testing in most states, Delaware wouldn't be an exception, that once testing goes into place, that's when things really are moving because it is in most states, Delaware has been talking about how that's going to feed into educator and student and school accountability metrics, sort of the Delaware's present flavor of what kind of started with No Child Left Behind years ago. So expect changes here, but you've got at least another year on your testing. The Next Generation Science Standards, when you think about them, and you think about moving away from that 3-unit-a-year model, you have to realize that it's really important that you understand that students are in the role of scientist and engineer, and that you understand that the instructional methods are going from sort of that traditional lower order thinking, here's a demonstration, remember, recall, repeat, activity before concept or culminating activities. All of those things are going away. And the reason is that the focus on higher order thinking is a focus on creating, evaluating, and analyzing simultaneously. And that's really evident in the science and engineering practices, which I'll show you in a moment. When you look at the 2009 student assessments, you can see the focus on lower order thinking. You can see here in this one here about ecosystems that name 3 specific living organisms and 3 specific non-living organisms. That's just remembering. Okay, you have a very similar thing over here in number 3. Name 3 environmental factors that could affect the growth of guppies. Just remember. This is a little bit higher order. Name 2 basic needs that organisms must have to survive. And it's only a little bit higher order because you have to explain how the organisms in the ecosystem are interdependent. So really what that is somewhere between, understanding and remembering. And the reason that understanding is making sense out of information, explaining, inferring, summarizing what you've learned previously. And again, number 4 is very lower order thinking. What is the source of energy for all ecosystems? That's just remembering that energy comes from the sun. That is the first bit of energy that comes into a food chain or food web. So very lower order thinking assessments. And I'm going to show you some assessments that are from the DC public schools, which are the first in the nation to have implemented a standardized test for the next generation science standards. And that went into effect in 2016, in May of 2016. So we'll see what kind of that difference is. And if you look even under some of the stuff that might have been higher order thinking under the previous Delaware assessments, it's still, again, kind of identifying things that were the result of perhaps direct instruction. This one here being elements of a woodland ecosystem that students would have learned about in constructing a food chain. And this is, I think, an example where it's worth pausing and thinking about how assessments are going to change. Because in this picture, if a student doesn't know the food that a toad eats or that a rabbit eats, then they're lost here. It's very much remembering what a toad eats, what a rabbit eats, and what a fox eats, and so on. So if you can't remember, then there's really no opportunity for success here on number 5. On number 6, again, you have a very similar thing, and actually it's a bit worse because here the student is being asked to look at the picture of the woodland ecosystem. If all largemouth bass disappear, describe how the number of perch and minnows in the food chain may be affected, and that would be higher order thinking. However, the way this question is constructed, you have perch, minnows, bass, duckweed, algae, and a heron. Well, we don't have any sense, unless it was the result of direct instruction, whether perch eat minnows, whether minnows are herbivores, the minnows are herbivores, carnivores, or so on, because like fish fry, all fish have fry. Minnows is, are they baby perch? Are they baby bass, in essence? Are they carnivores? Are they herbivores? And so on. So, these kind of questions are going to disappear in the next generation science assessments, and I'll show you a little bit of that later. However, this question, which you would have seen previously, style is going to be more like what you would be used to under assessments and of the next generation science standards. The reason is that the next generation science standards are performance expectations. Despite having the word standard in there, they aren't a standalone fact to remember like previous standards were. They are what students are going to be expected to demonstrate as a result, or be able to demonstrate, have the ability to demonstrate as a result of instruction. So questions that you would have seen under the DCAS where students had to refer to tables and use that information to form a conclusion would be much more along the lines of what you'll see. However, you're not likely to see something like this, write 2 conclusions that are supported by the data, because that's a poorly formed prompt where you would more likely to see something like write 2 opposing conclusions that are supported by the data, or write 2 different conclusions that are supported by the same data, something like that. And down here, what are 3 possible causes? So this is more analysis. If we go back to that, what are 3 possible causes, maybe even evaluating. But you can see despite all of those examples, there aren't too many forays into the higher order thinking tier of creating, evaluating, and analyzing. So expect that to change. And the reason is that there's a movement under the next generation science standards. The model of instruction has to change. The traditional model under that 3-unit-a-year approach to science that has been commonplace in Delaware, content flows through a teacher. most oftentimes. And that's not to say that that's everybody's mode of instruction. Inquiry is supposed to be sort of infused across the standards, but now it's required. Under the kind of previous versions, it was possible that content could flow through a teacher, that the teacher could model the facts, demonstrate the phenomenon, there could be worksheets and sort of culminating activities and whatever, and there could be an entirely sort of literacy, and I shouldn't even say literacy, a reading-based approach, sort of a textbook approach where students have to absorb what was modeled, demonstrated, what was explained in the textbook or by the teacher, and then could show that they had reached proficiency by recalling those facts, by repeating the demonstration, summarizing the phenomenon. And we just saw that. That's why I showed you that first. If you can recall, if you can remember, you can pretty much ace this assessment. There's really not much thinking required. Under the next generation science standards, there's sort of a next generation model of instruction that changes the relationship between the student and the content. See here, there's a teacher that's directly between the student and the content. So what flows through that teacher or through the assessment or through the textbook is what the student has to remember and then recall. Here, under the next generation science standards, students are developing skills. And they're using those skills are skills specific to the discipline of science and engineering. They're using those skills to develop and use the content. Okay, so when we think about content in the next generation science standards, we have to think about disciplinary core ideas dimension and the cross-cutting concepts. So you can imagine, instead of students seeing a demonstration and then going and carrying out what they saw in their groups, here they are tackling with a problem or question. They're using those science and engineering practices to actually engage the content in context, to observe how the system behavior happens, because that's what the cross-cutting concepts are. And the teacher is helping to gradually adjust the supports for the student or the student teams, and they're helping students understand how to engage appropriately. And the teacher is redirecting and monitoring the classroom. They are engaging the students in the Socratic dialogue as a group and helping students to make concept to concept, concept to self, and concept to world connections. So it's really a much different model because the students aren't being asked to recall, they're being asked to use and develop. And they're being expected and taught skills. They're being taught skills, they're being expected to use those skills, and they're being expected to learn processes and develop and use processes to go from a problem to an evidence-based answer or a solution, or a question to an evidence-based answer. So the students' demonstration, the way that they demonstrate proficiency is very, very different. Okay, they're using skills to solve problems, answer questions, and as a result, they're able to use sort of the system behavior, those cross-cutting concepts, to understand and describe content, and also how content dynamically interacts with other content. And this is what scientists and engineers do. That's why it's part of the next generation science standards. The scientists don't watch other scientists and just repeat what they did exactly. They might do something like that to verify a claim, but that's, scientists extend knowledge, engineers solve problems, and so when you're extending knowledge, that means that you're, extending into a place where something's unknown. In the case of a traditional model, everything is known to the student, right? It's told to them, and they mirror back. That's why you see these next generation science standards shown in 3 dimensions this way. So students who demonstrate understanding can perform the expectation, that performance expectation. That's why that's often inappropriately referred to as a standard, but that's what it is. It's a performance expectation. It's a standard that you have up there, and it exists in the context of 3 dimensions, which are those 3 foundation boxes you see here. You can see the different elements of each of those dimensions. What's going to be really, I think, earth-shattering to educators as they ultimately see what the assessments look like, and they try to move their instruction from a traditional model to a next generation model or to really update their curriculum so that students are really learning by being scientists and engineers versus watching and repeating, is this science and engineering practices dimension. And the reason that's going to be so kind of earth-shaking is that the students are the ones who have to have developed these practices, these skills, not the teacher. Okay, the teacher can have these practices, but the teacher is only, I guess in an accountability sense, maybe being assessed, but it's the students who are being assessed and who are expected to be able to demonstrate. So if a student can't develop a model to describe phenomena, then they have not mastered that practice. Okay, and they have to be able to do that related to the disciplinary core ideas, which you see in that next box here as it relates to the standard. So that's how a context kind of comes together. When we think about the practices, there are really at a high level 8 of them. So this is what a student sort of skill set has to consist of at a basic level. So these are tools that they need to be able to use as scientists and engineers in the classroom and also show on their assessments. They need to be able to ask questions in the context of science and define problems in the context of engineering. Not only use a model, but develop it. Not only carry out an investigation, but actually plan it. That's huge. Okay, that means not handing students a lab or writing it on the board, but actually having students have the skills and the process knowledge to be able to plan their own investigation. That's how you go from a problem to an evidence-based solution, or from a question to an evidence-based answer. Okay, hypothesizing, planning procedures, carrying out those procedures, developing the data, using the data, analyzing it, and forming an evidence-based conclusion. So you can see they're going to have to use computational and mathematical thinking, construct an explanation or design a solution, and that's in the case of constructing an explanation, really thinking about evidence involved there. That's just why you see number 7 here, engaging an argument from evidence. When you construct an explanation or you've designed a solution, you have to be able to prove that it's actually an explanation or a solution. So you have to be able to argue from evidence, and that evidence comes from your planned investigation, the data you gathered, and so on, not because your data said so, but specific data. Really specific data points, or the difference in mean and so on. So obtaining, evaluating, and communicating information are key elements of the tool set. And these are practices that go K-12. What changes is the complexity of how students, or the situations in which students apply the practices, so those contexts, and the sophistication with which they observe and can respond and so on. So when you look at a second grade classroom, students are going to be engaged as scientists or engineers in a very similar way, just a slightly different context and with different complexity than you would see students who are heading towards middle school, who are engaged as scientists or engineers. And in this case, these students are engaged as engineers, and they are developing their plan. You can see that they are working together in small teams. They are taking apart a problem, and the nonfiction reading has already occurred. The Socratic dialogue has already occurred. It's now, they're on the front lines. It's now up to them to be engineers, to think about the problem, think about what they've read, think about what they've discussed, and begin applying those tools to solve that problem through an approach that their team is going to decide. So, both of these are examples of students who are using our program, but I point this out because it's really important that, science and engineering be authentic. And by being authentic, I mean that it's not something that's repeated, but something that's actually generated, that it's organic to those two students and how they're applying their thinking, their ideas. And then it's an opportunity to learn about themselves and their thinking, and to create and evaluate and analyze their own ideas, and then compare that to the ideas of others as part of that scientific argumentation process. The next generation science standards, and as you think about that environment, they're naturally integrated. So when the next generation science standards were developed, they were developed after the ELA Common Core and the Math Common Core standards. And so when you see students developing plans, they're actually developing a nonfiction text. There are also communication, writing, and technical ELA subject standards that relate to science, which are all applied in this environment. The nonfiction reading component as well, all of those reading strategies are able to be applied in the science environment. And again, I can't emphasize enough that the students are developing a nonfiction text as they're writing their plan, but they're also doing process writing. They are also doing applied math. So when you think about the Common Core math practices, those math practices very closely relate to the science and engineering practices. So when you look down Common Core State Standards math practices, you'll be able to see that all of those are applied in this next generation inquiry environment. Things like gathering data, graphing, not only gathering the data but analyzing the data are all math Common Core connections which occur within a next generation science inquiry environment. Remember those higher order thinking skills we were talking about, creating, evaluating, and analyzing? Well, those are key not only for science, as I said earlier, but also for ELA and math. And when it comes to science, the things that are really only science time on learning are the experimenting and prototyping themselves. So it's key to realize that there are these connections. There are also social justice connections. There are social studies connections. There are, infinite place-based learning connections and art connections. And we'll talk about this a little further later, but really the type of critical thinking skills, those creative, evaluative, and analytical thinking skills, are the connection between science and art. And we'll talk a little bit more about that later. So coming back to higher order thinking, if you look at what DC is presently doing in the DCAS, their new Common Assessment Program is really focusing not only on the next generation science standards, but also on these higher order thinking skills because they're so closely related. So let's take a look at those. So this is a sample item that was released in 2015. Now, there are 3 categories of items in the DC 2016 student assessment. These are examples for 2016. They were released in 2015, but these are actual examples. Their testing is going to be taken on computers. More power to them. But the key here is that there are constructed responses, which are open response. There are selected responses, which are multiple choice. And then there are what's called technologically enhanced questions, which are drag and drop type things. So again, I suppose other than maybe making the testing a little more efficient in terms of how that data is transferred and stored and graded and things like that, the fact that it's done on a computer doesn't really do much for the testing. Unfortunately, it may actually hinder the testing because you have sort of the, what happens when the power goes out. If a student, has physical impairment, can't touch a screen or something like this. So it is what it is. What you see in front of you is an example of a constructed response. And this is what I mean by a next generation science assessment. You can see here how the practices and the processes are coming together in a scenario. Very different than what you would see under Delaware's previous assessment program. So I'm not, and before I go too much further, I'm not saying that Delaware is going to adopt exactly what DC has. But what I do want to emphasize is that at present there are next generation standardized test models available that states are using, and they all look like this. They aren't all on computers, but they all have the sort of same structure, flavor, because they're performance-based assessments. Okay, so when you look at this, the students are given Trevor and Kayla, and there is a school garden, and Kayla's class has been growing beans planted in soda bottles and given water and nutrients in their classroom. And Kayla's class made their own hydroponic system, in fact, by taking a number of steps. Now, what's kind of interesting here is that under our program, we wouldn't accept this because the steps here are actually don't meet the guidelines. Removing the bottle cap, for instance, is not a legitimate step in a scientific context because we don't have a materials list. So what are we removing the bottle cap from? Are we removing it from the bottle? I suppose that means that we assume that the bottle came with the cap on and so on. So there are actually some deficiencies in just the way you see this now, but nonetheless, cutting a bottle in half, you know, putting the top half of the bottle into the bottom half of the bottle and so on and so forth. So nonetheless, the student is given an example here of how Kayla's class used a basic procedure to try and make this little device to grow a plant. Trevor and Kayla wondered if the plants would grow in soil or in water better. So to find out, they did the following experiment. Now here, we have no sense of steps or order, but you can see that they're showing the student that they planted beans at the same time, that Trevor put his in soil, that Kayla put hers in water, and both students watered their seeds every 2 to 3 days. Both students' plants received the same amount of sunlight. So, you know, they should have probably said that Kayla planted her seeds only in water in the same type of bottle and so on. But nonetheless, they show what happened. They give some results from the observation of the stem height of each of these plants. And again, the stem height isn't shown on a diagram here, so hopefully students know what the stem height is. Based on the results, students in the class who are reading this, who are actually being tested, are going to be asked who's making the correct claim. So Trevor makes a claim and Kayla makes a claim. Trevor's claim is that the bean plants grew faster in the soil in the garden because soil provides the nutrients for plants to grow. Kayla's claim is the bean plants grew better in water in the soda bottle because water provides the nutrients for plants to grow. So it's kind of interesting that we don't have a hypothesis here. What we have is a test without a hypothesis, and we have two claims. And so what the student has to do, is being asked to do here, is evaluate whose claim is correct. And it's implied that they need to use the data in these tables in order to support their choice. And in fact, what they're really looking for is for students to form an evidence-based conclusion. So to look at one of these claims, to say whether it is true or false, and then use the data to support why that is true or false. So that requires a lot of a student, and these could be tightened up quite a bit, but you can see that there's a scenario, there's data, there are practices or skills that the student needs to use as a tool to be able to take that scenario apart, to be able to evaluate a claim, and to be able to actually sort of develop their own evidence by perhaps looking at the data and looking at the difference, or calculating an average and looking at the difference of averages between the two stem heights in soil versus water. And then use that evidence to support their claim about somebody else's claim. So I think you can see here it's a big departure from remembering 3 parts of a food chain or something like this. And it puts a lot more in the student to be able to mentally be in the role of scientist or engineer, looking at another student who has gone through something and has made a claim that may or may not be true. So this is a very, very common kind of model. Again, not quite as well developed, I would say, as the New England Common Assessment Program model that was developed by Measured Progress and had been in use in Maine, New Hampshire, Rhode Island, Vermont, you know, for the better part of 10 years under the inquiry portions of those tests. But nonetheless, you can see this is where it's headed. These are examples of, so this one here would be a technology-enhanced item where students have to drag and drop the animals and plants, you know, herbivores, so producers, herbivores, carnivores, omnivores, or so on, into a food web down below. And this is at a grade 5 level, by the way, if you're wondering. All of what I'm showing you is grade 5. And then when you look at item 3, this is an example of a selected response, or what we would commonly call multiple choice, where students have to look at the food chain in this pond and actually select an answer that's most appropriate when they're asked which of the following statements best describes the movement of matter in the pond food chain. Select, in this case it's actually select 3 correct answers and use, they're asked a follow-up question, use the model of the pond food chain to describe the relationship between the organisms in the pond food chain and the exchange of matter back into the environment. So that aspect would actually be a constructed response. So what you see at the top is selected and the bottom would be constructed, all based on this. And what's kind of interesting is actually that you can see that the difference between the example I showed you for Delaware, where I'll just snap back to that real quick. Let's see here. Do you see here there's a connection? So this is DC. See how the sun is here, there's algae, and then there's a movement of matter and also energy from the algae to the minnows, from the minnows to the perch, from the perch to the bass, from the bass to the heron. So if a student understands the system relationship between, it's really the system dynamics of food chains and food webs, they can answer this question. If they understand energy transfer in a food chain and food web, they can answer this question. If they understand what perch eat, they can answer this question, as well as bass, as well as heron, and so on. So there are multiple entry points, or we might think of them as on-ramps for students who actually can perform the expectation. And so it's not anchored entirely in rote memorization the way that it would be here. You see here, there's no relationship shown on either of these food chain or food web related questions. And again, like I said about the minnows, minnows, like fish fry, you know, what particular species of minnow is this that we're talking about over here? When you look at the fox, is this a baby fox? Because you know, a young fox may eat a toad, not necessarily a rabbit. And when you look at the scale between if a student is trying to infer the scale between the fox and the tree, you know, it's much more the size of a mountain lion than a fox. So there's a lot of limitations with that traditional model of assessment that go away in this next generation model because there's a lot of focus on really how sort of the systems combine with the content, and the fact that it's less emphasis on students remembering the right or a specific right or wrong answer, as it is a student's ability to kind of think through a situation or a scenario and form the connections using the tools and the processes that they've learned to be able to answer any question or solve any problem. That's what's happening here, okay? And happening through different means. Like I said, multiple choice, open response, even drag and drop. Those connections in these, so as students are constructing responses or even analyzing a scenario, they are engaging in Common Core technical subject standards. And here's some examples: citing evidence to support analysis, summarizing text distinct from prior knowledge, following precisely a multi-step procedure. That's one of the weaknesses that you see here. See, this is a multi-step procedure. This is really the procedure down here. It's not specific enough in a lot of ways, but it's not given really a chronological multiple ordinal step indicator the way that it is up here. So that's one of the weaknesses, but nonetheless, you can see following precisely a multi-step procedure is not actually a NGSS standard. It's an ELA Common Core standard, expressing information visually, distinguishing among facts, reasoned judgment, based on research findings and speculation and tests. We saw all of that going on in these examples. Okay, so what that means is that in order for students to really be kind of making cross-curricular connections, they have to be brought together in the classroom, and there's a perfect opportunity to do that in the context of Science Time on Learning now. If we make the leap in aligning our classroom instruction to what's required in that sort of next generation inquiry model, and leaving behind sort of that traditional model of rote memorization and content flowing through a teacher, and students observing and then recalling. Or just, and I think one of the key differentiators too, and we could talk about this more in a second, is that a lot of even these, FOSS, STC, KIT, Smithsonian, so on, these hands-on experiments really are students doing a demonstration for themselves. So instead of a teacher doing one demonstration and all the students kind of observing that and then filling out a worksheet related to it, or and then reading about it in textbook or something, a lot of those kits call themselves next generation, but they really aren't well aligned because effectively, at least in my opinion, it's the student doing the demonstration for themselves. Whether they're following a multi-step procedure that was given to them, whether they're following a diagram, they are doing something that was given to them, and yes, they will observe it in front of themselves, hands-on, with materials, but that is not the same thing as students actually engaging the problem or question as a scientist, as an engineer, developing the skill, using the skill to develop and use the content through an investigation they have planned authentically themselves. Very, very different. And that's why that's how we approach it. We approach it very differently. Students, from their earliest days are engaged in planning. And by 4th grade, they are actually planning their investigation soup to nuts. And that's why we see such significant data gains, because students aren't just developing some tools. They're actually developing process knowledge. They're mastering the engineering design process, the scientific process, or sometimes called scientific method. And the fact that process exists does not mean that science or engineering is linear. That's not what we're saying. But in fact, that if we can teach students how to be logical in their pursuit of a problem or question, we equip them not only for performance on standardized testing, but performance in life. When they have a problem or question, they need to make decisions about how to proceed logically and efficiently. Okay, and you can see that the math Common Core practices, which we have here, are very closely related to what we've just seen, what I just described, as well as the science and engineering practices I showed you earlier. Students making sense of problems, persevering in solving them, reasoning abstractly and quantitatively, constructing viable arguments, critiquing the reasoning of others, modeling with math, using tools appropriately and strategically, attending to precision, making use of structure, and that structure, by the way, I just mentioned process. Process is structure. Okay, there are different processes for engineering and science. You can't take one process and apply it to the other because they exist for different purposes. Okay, expressing regularity and repeated reasoning. What does that mean? That means using recursive steps, having efficient procedures. We didn't see any of that in the test example I just showed you, but nonetheless, it's there and it matters, and it's a great opportunity. Science is now, under the Next Generation Science Standards, a great opportunity to reinforce and master Common Core math practices and Common Core ELA standards. Why does changing from a traditional model of STEM instruction or science instruction in the classroom to a next generation model really matter? It's because behind all these standards, we really have a new definition of effective STEM instruction, and I'll read it to you here. This comes directly from the National Research Council. It's been around for a while. And National Research Council was involved in the really foundation of the new standards, which is why this definition is reflected so boldly in the new standards. So effective instruction capitalizes, or science instruction capitalizes on students' early interest and experiences. It identifies and builds on what they know and provides them with the experiences to engage them in the practices of science and sustain their interest. So what we're seeing is a movement from what you see on the left to what you see on the right in these images. The traditional model is a teacher, having a lot of fun and pre-teaching, modeling what you see there, and then students are going to absorb that, demonstration and go and repeat what she's done. That is not engaging students in the practices. Okay, the students don't have to engage those tools, those 8 practices that I showed you earlier, in order to repeat what they've seen. What you see on the right is students having a problem or question which they haven't seen the answer to, and so they have to use those tools, the practices of science and engineering, in order to solve the problem or answer the question. And by virtue of actually engaging students thinking that way, you sustain their interest. But it's also important to understand that sustaining student interest is also about having a scope and sequence which is focused and rigorous. A 3-unit-a-year model is not oftentimes rigorous enough and focused enough for students to feel a sense of momentum and connection between one strand and one concept and the next. And part of the reason for that is that and this is one of the, I think, Achilles' heels of the next generation science standards, is that people view grade-specific standards as meaning, that's the only standard that's, quote, covered in that grade level. If that's the approach you take, you're going to have systemic gaps in your curriculum. In fact, that there's a big difference between curriculum and standards. Standards are the minimum expectation of what a student is going to be able to demonstrate as evidence of learning. However, curriculum's job is to pool standards together so that students are having their understanding of standards across multiple grade levels introduced, mastered, and reinforced continually as contexts change and hands-on experiences change. So, so that's something that's really important to point out there. So starting with students early, when you see here capitalizing on students' early interest and experiences, that means starting early, pre-K, kindergarten, and actually nurturing student understanding intentionally through their curriculum, scaffolding from one grade level to the next. Not this sort of long-term spiral where something happens once and then again in 3 or 4 years at a different level. That is too disconnected. Building on what students know is that intentional nurturing process. Providing them with experiences to engage them in the practices is putting them in the role of scientist and engineer, and sustaining their interest is articulating your curriculum in such a way that students are able to make the connections themselves. And that's a very thoughtful, skillful process. One I think we've done really well here at KnowAtom. We take this definition very seriously, but it's one that I think is incredibly difficult for educators, and I believe that that's one of the reasons why, when you look at the resources available on the Department of Education's website for Delaware, you don't see the lessons and the units available. They're not publicly available because they're very hard to create, and they aren't ready yet for Delaware. And I think the state of Delaware and those in the cohorts that are testing them are learning an awful lot about what it means to engage student thinking, what it means to articulate units and scaffold and so on. So there is a lot going on here, and one of the ways to leapfrog that is, and that's what a lot of our clients are doing, is to find a solution which is next generation aligned. But that's very difficult. There aren't a lot of them out there. So the best thing you can do is educate yourself on effective STEM instruction, the standards, and then try to find one like KnowAtom, or try to develop one, but expect that as you develop it, that you're most likely going to not be able to use a lot of what you currently have, and that you're going to need to probably tweak a lot every year, probably for the next 5 to 10 years. That has been our experience as we were developing and implementing next generation science curriculum, is that we had to tweak a lot along the way, but it's worth it. The data gains are going to be there, but it's not an easy process, and that is really because the resources that are available are really aimed at different tiers of student learning, or they have different student learning value. And I'll just go through this really quickly. So at an awareness level, you have the kind of resources that companies produce. Hey, here's what we do, here's what an engineer is, and so as a result, students can tell you what an engineer is or who an engineer is, but not much more than that. Knowledge readiness is the kind of thing we often associate with textbooks, where a concept is explained. So learning all about what a scientist has discovered or engineer has created in terms of technology. Performance readiness is something that we think about with kits, where you learn about the hardness of a rock or mineral, and so if you want to find out how hard a rock or mineral is, you can do a hardness test, and here's how you do that. So there's a task that the students learn that's specific to a piece of data you want to gather, or so on, so they can perform a task. Mastery readiness is what we look for here at KnowAtom, what we design resources for. It's beyond what you get with a kit, because really it looks back at the kind of things that we were looking at earlier, the idea that students are developing those practices, knowledge of those practices, those skills, and also process knowledge, and then use those STEM practices as tools. And they use those tools to be able to answer a question or solve a problem. So if we think about it, that's what we saw here. So if a student is able to form an argument from evidence, they are going to be able to use that as a tool to engage a problem like this and actually go in and analyze the data, understand that this was a procedure that these children carried out, look at a claim and evaluate the claim using their analysis of the evidence, and form a data-based argument and argue from the evidence that's given about their own idea as an observer here. So that's really key. That's what mastery is all about. Not tasks specific, like if I want to find out how hard a rock is, what do I do, that you get with performance readiness, but in fact skills that you can apply as tools to pursue the scientific process or the engineering design process, to go from a problem to an evidence-based solution, or a question to an answer that way, through the use of experimentation. So in a nutshell, the changes that are happening are pretty significant, and I'm going to wrap up here, but the changes are really great for student learning, and I'll just show you some of the results that we've seen. This is an inner city urban school that has 96% high needs, 93% low income, 66% of the students' first language is not English, and the state average for advanced and proficient is 50% in Massachusetts. And yet over time you can see the positive trend that has developed and how they're closing that gap to the state level, and how the number of or percentage of students scoring in the warning and failing categories has dropped nearly to 0 over the course of time. So one of the interesting things about these corrections that you see here, these little downward data bumps, these were changes in administration in the district, and then over here in administration in the building, and there's also changes of teachers that are going on over here as well. So nonetheless, building that skill set in students from the early grade levels, and this is grade 5 testing, you can see that the students are continually able to lean on those skills. Even in times when there are changes, really shocks to the building, they don't fall back to where they were previously. Now, we see things like that in New Hampshire, where students are 20% above grade level in test data. And when we look at the different state level testing that has been in place there under the NECAP assessment, New England Common Assessment Program, we see that our students are these higher ones here, and the state average are the lower ones. That in both test years here that you can see, again, significant lead of the students using KnowAtom versus those that weren't because of our approach, and especially in inquiry. I mean, look at the difference in inquiry. Because that thinking, that creating, evaluating, analyzing really is the foundation of inquiry. Here's another example from an inner city district, 75% high needs, 35% first languages in English. Over the course of 2.5 years, they added 51 points to their advanced and proficient. Again, this one's in Massachusetts, where the state average is 50%. So these are inner city kids, 35% first language not English, 70% high needs that are outperforming state average, and in some cases reaching 80, something like 86% advanced and proficient, 87%. The downfalls that we see here in the data are the result of changes in teachers. Unfortunately, teachers who had professional development and so on were moved to other buildings. Brand new teachers came in. You can see the positive trend, but again, it is what it is. Teachers really matter, and so thankfully they're able to join up, and you see, pick up, and the trend continues. But this particular district did not have professional development after the first year or so. Having those teachers being able to kind of join up and pick up with the program is really a big deal. This is kind of an opposite type environment where there's only 7% low income, but you can see the data gain and how it's sustained over time. Again, functioning in the 80s for proficiency. This is one of the highest districts, schools in Massachusetts. It's actually number 1, 90% proficient. Similar over here, 70 some odd, 75% I believe proficient. And even you can look at some really troubled middle schools here where they've gained over the course of 2 years 26 points in their advanced and proficient scoring students, where they had only 4% previously. They now have 28. So it's very, very significant. And I would say that when you look at these schools, like that one in particular, it's not easy. These are urban schools I've just shown you, 95% low income, high needs, so on. You see that data gain for that middle school I just showed you. They're meeting almost all of their accountability targets set by the date, which you see in red, and they're still getting accountability points for approaching that target so closely in the ELL and in the white subgroup you see here. And so what I want to just point out here is that in the case of Delaware, this is what it's likely to look like as the science testing under NGSS comes into the accountability frameworks, because this is a known model for establishing a composite performance index for schools specifically, and looking at their subgroup populations and their performance, setting targets, performance targets, and then actually tracking those targets from one year to the next. And then what you see here on the right, these points are actually added to that accountability framework for the school. So basically, the more points, the better you are as a school, and there are certain tiers. In the case of Massachusetts, they've set tiers where at certain levels you are, go into sort of oversight by the state versus you have no oversight by the state because you're so high performing. So big things to think about as you attempt to master the next generation of science standards in Delaware. I'll offer you a few resources here before I jump off. Again, my name is Francis Vigent. I was a co-founder of KnowAtom 10 years ago. I function now as CEO, former teacher, passionate about science education, and our team here is as well. If you'd like to reach out about any of the resources you've seen, or if you have questions, please do. You can also reach out to one of our STEM specialists. You can go on, contact us through our website, KnowAtom.com. We have a few great resources I'd turn you to here. One, stay connected. Subscribe to our blog, KnowAtom.com/blog. You can follow us on Facebook. It's facebook.com/KnowAtom, or on Twitter, handle is KnowAtom. You can see a case study from that district and that urban district I had taken some screenshots from for you here, knowatom.com/results. And you can see curriculum and reader samples that are grade-specific and next generation aligned, which they're free online. You can download them, knowatom.com/curriculum, or if you wish, you can reach out to us as well. We do have more than what's there, but again, those are available for purchase along with materials and professional development. So, you know, you're welcome to take a look at what we've made available for free there. And if you have questions or are in the process of looking to adopt next generation aligned resources that do a great job, please feel free to reach out to myself and I can get you to the right person, or through our website. And there are additional webinar resources like this available online if you go to knowatom.com/resources. Thank you for your time, and I hope that you found this session helpful. Bye now.